Britain's conversation, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. I wonder whether the wind is beginning to change ever so slightly in direction. I get a feeling that Eurosceptic, even ERG, Conservative MPs are beginning to think that the Remainers are on the verge of plotting a great coup. A coup not just against the Brexit result, but actually against parliamentary precedent and everything else. And they're beginning to think maybe compromise is the only way forward. Earlier on today, on Sky News, European Research Group member and Conservative MP Daniel Kaczynski was asked whether the ERG could compromise on their red lines.
There is a threat to Brexit, and my association believe that there are many members of Parliament, Remainer members of Parliament, who technically could take Brexit away from us, either through another referendum or extending Article 50 or the rest of it. So if we hold out for too long, and if we continue to express our concerns about every aspect of this deal, rather than focusing on the key problems, then members of my association believe that we could end up with no Brexit at all, and that's something that I don't want to contemplate.
OK, well, very interesting point of view given by Daniel. And he obviously went on to say, because he talked there about we mustn't be concerned about every aspect of the deal, but he focused in on one, and in particular, he was basically saying that if Theresa May's New Deal included a 5-year limit on the backstop, he might be able to support it.
I think I could live with a backstop lasting for only 5 years, because then we know that there is a time limit to this and that we will not be trapped indefinitely in this backstop without any form of escaping from it.
So what Daniel Kaczynski is saying is that he might be prepared to accept this, and that would mean we'd be free of the European Union, folks, 9 years after we voted Brexit. I suggest from the intonation of my voice you may begin to understand what I feel about this. But this afternoon, at a Bruges Group meeting, a heavily packed Bruges Group meeting in London, the ERG Group leader and LBC presenter Jacob Rees-Mogg, catch him this Friday from 6 p.m. Even Jacob was saying he'd prefer a deal that said there'd be changes to the backstop.
I think the truth is that everybody wants a deal. The Prime Minister wants a deal, the EU wants a deal,
I don't want a deal, not this deal.
And if the only way to get it is by reopening the text, that is what they will have to do. This is realpolitik. And if they do that, then people like me will consider what is done.
So what we're hearing there from Jacob is we all want a deal. Well, I'm sorry, Jacob, and I love Jacob, but I don't want a rotten deal. Remember, no deal is better than a bad deal, a phrase that I coined in the referendum that was parroted by the Prime Minister without even meaning it, and now they're all saying maybe a bad deal is better than no deal. But the reason is they're scared of Yvette Cooper. They're scared, of course, of Dominic Grieve, Anna Soubry, and all these people who they frankly see as kamikazes, prepared to do anything to stop Brexit from happening. I accept that maybe I can't get everything I wanted from Brexit on day one, but even if you limit the backstop to 5 years and you find it acceptable that 9 years after the vote we can finally be free, what about the 39 billion? What about the ability to get back our fisheries? What about the fact we'll be trapped inside the same levels of regulatory alignment? What about the fact we won't be free and able to make our own trade deals? I do understand where the argument for compromise is coming from. Have to say I'm not part of it. And if we do get some compromise, and by the way, you know, Frans Timmermans, who's Juncker's number 2, said today there is no compromise on the backstop. But hey, this is a negotiation, and it often goes to the 11th hour. If we do find Parliament passing some form of this agreement, don't think it's all over then. Because, of course, the final vote isn't in Westminster. The final vote will be in Strasbourg in March, and I'll be a part of it. And right at the moment, I just think what's on offer, unless we get radical change, is unacceptable. But hey, that's me. Let me ask you, are the Brexiteers right to start to begin softening their stance? And if you think, hey, if it means at least we leave the European Union, let's make those compromises. Call 0345 6060 973. Maybe like me, you think they're beginning to sell out for fear of what the establishment might do, then text to 84850. Oh, and by the way, if you've got any better ideas, please do tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, Facebookers who watch us live, you can comment too. Michael is a first-time caller from Farnham. Michael, does it now make sense for the ERG to compromise the reasons that they voted against Mrs May's deal last week?
I'm afraid it does, because I'm just so afraid of the alternative. Even if we get out in 9 years, as you say, which is dreadful.
Dreadful.
But if we stay in, as I understand it, and you can confirm this, you're the only politician I trust, we lose our currency, we lose our fishing, we lose our oil and gas rights, we lose our army, we lose planning legislation because of the wretched Lisbon Treaty.
Well, Michael, the Lisbon Treaty has huge aspirations, and indeed, just yesterday we saw Macron and Merkel updating the 1963 Elysee Treaty, and they're now pushing full on for European armies, for all member states to join the euro. So, yes, that's where the European Union intends to go. Why anybody, Michael, would wish to say part of it, I don't know. But isn't the alternative, Michael, I put this to you, isn't the alternative, if we don't vote for this deal, the worst case scenario is not that list you gave me, necessarily. The worst case scenario is a second referendum. And isn't it perhaps now the point at which we say it's worth risking a second referendum rather than accepting most of the terms of Mrs May's deal?
I really have seen the way they have totally tried to emasculate the first referendum. I just don't trust them, I'm afraid. We saw Cameron throw £9 million, which he shouldn't have done, trying to bring the Ramonas on side. Can you explain to me why the Ramonas are so interested in emasculating us?
Oh, because they don't believe in us, Michael. There was a flippant comment once made by Ken Clarke, who said, he would like to see the House of Commons have about the amount of power as a local rate-capped authority. Some of them believe in the European dream, the European project. Others just go with the flow. And that's where we are. When you really, Michael, when you actually tackle them on what the European project is, they have little knowledge. But, Michael, let me share with you a birthday. Because today is the 6th anniversary of David Cameron making the famous Bloomberg speech. Do you remember the speech in which he said, if I get a majority, I will call a referendum? And he did it, Michael, because I'd put enough salt on his tail, I think, to frighten the life out of him. And, Michael, all I'm saying to you is I just don't believe that if we give in to being part of a customs union without any promise until, under the Kaczynski plan, 2025, of getting out and being free, I just don't think that's good enough, Michael.
It isn't. It's just, couldn't the alternative be even worse? OK, no, Michael, look, I get it, and that's the calculation that Jacob's making. That's the calculation Daniel Kaczynski's making. That's the calculation when it comes to the final vote in the European Parliament I'm going to have to make. At the moment, I am not sold on this compromise. Michael, thank you for your call, your kind words, and indeed your passion. Would you go for 2.5 years on the backstop, I'm being asked? No! Look, can we just get one thing straight, folks? We voted on the 23rd of June 2016 to leave the European Union. Anything that runs into the 2020s is completely and wholly and utterly unacceptable. And here we get, and I've been expecting this message for some time. Yes, time for a second referendum, finally push a proper Brexit over the line. Now that is, amongst Brexiteers at the moment, a minority view, but I'm beginning to get letters in my mailbox from people saying, let's fight them again and let's beat them big time. Rob is a first-time caller from Taunton. Good evening, Rob.
Hi, good evening.
Welcome to the show. So, Rob, is it time to compromise just to get us out of this wretched union on the 29th of March?
Sadly, I think probably it is. I was always in agreement with you that no deal is better than a bad deal, but I'm worried now that bad deal might be better than not leaving at all.
Rob, am I finding myself? Am I beginning to whistle against the wind, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think the deal they've got up at the moment is not acceptable. I think if there was a time limit on the Irish backstop, then maybe it would be better than nothing. But I really think that if they go to a second referendum, I mean, if you were the government in 2016 and you lost the referendum, what's the best way to stay in the EU? Spend 2 years pretending you're putting together the best deal possible, mess it up as much as possible,
about, yes,
and have a second referendum, and then you know people are going to vote to stay.
Well, hang on, Rob. I don't agree with that. I do not agree with the idea that if there was a second referendum, we'd change our minds. In fact, I begin to think we'd give them a big Anglo-Saxon 2 fingers up.
Well, I'll certainly be with you trying to do that, and I'll vote. I think the hardcore Remainers will stay the same, and I think the hardcore Leavers will stay the same. I just worry about the floaters in the middle, who can see all this catastrophe that the government has caused, but the government is saying they've done their best, and that they will then think that remaining is a safe option. That's what I worry about.
So, Rob, maybe we just sort of take this little Pyrrhic victory of leaving the treaty and get on with our lives.
At least we wouldn't be in it, but it's far from ideal, and they should have respected what we said and left with no deal.
We wouldn't be in it. We wouldn't be in it in name, Rob, but in every other way, we would be in it. We'd be handing over vast sums of money in return for a 28-page political declaration that you might as well use, folks, as loo paper, because it's valueless. Rob, thank you. Well, those first 2 phone calls have depressed me thoroughly. Somebody please come and cheer me up, 0345 6060 973, and tell me we cannot compromise to the extent of saying that if the backstop's limited until 2025, that's somehow okay. It's not okay. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC at 6:15. So Daniel Kaczynski of the ERG says that if the backstop was limited until 2025, he might vote for Mrs May's deal, and Jacob indicates he's on the road to compromising as well. Is this acceptable? Is this the right thing to do? And I'm keen to hear from you, whether you're Leavers or Remainers, whether this makes sense. Helen has a strong view, and she says, I'm disgusted that 5 years is okay by the ERG. Not in my name. I won't vote for this lot again. Well, we hear that over and over and over. And how funny that all of this is happening, this softening is happening, as on the other side of the channel, the panic that I've been predicting for a couple of years over what would happen in a no-deal scenario is beginning to come through. Firstly, on fisheries, the European Union announced today they want to continue the status quo with fisheries until the end of 2019 if the UK exits with no deal. They wish to grant access for UK vessels to their waters as long as EU vessels are granted reciprocal access to our waters. Well, of course they are, with the quota system, for example, in the Western Channel, where they get 90% of the haddock and we get 10. So slight signs of genuine concern over fisheries, but what about agriculture? This is really interesting. So Christiane Lambert, president of the National Federation of Agricultural Holders Unions, has warned the most affected agricultural sector would be wines and spirits. The second victim would be dairy products. The EU has a positive balance of 100 million euros every year. Well, actually it's billion euros, but maybe it's million in dairy products. And it says the Brits are very fond of brie. She's also worried about the apple sector. So, folks, the one area where tariffs would be high would be on agricultural dairy, cheese type apple products. And you're seeing them really beginning to flap, to panic, because they sell us a lot more than we sell them. And on both agriculture and fisheries, hearing this today makes you realise how strong the negotiating position is of the British government. The great cards they've got in their hand, but they've never, ever played them. And that makes me think they're a pretty weak and useless lot. That's my view. Yet, here we are tonight, talking about compromise, and it coming from ERG members, some supposedly are the toughest Eurosceptics in the country. And the reason is they fear a coup by the Remainers to stop Brexit. James is a first-time caller from Oxford. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nigel. I was a keen Remainer. I am now... Back yourselves. You won. Go for it. And let's not stop pussyfooting around these Europeans.
Yep.
And now we need to back ourselves. It's quite disturbing again today to hear that we are not backing our great country. And I'm just fed up with it, really. Let's get on with it. Businesses will sort it out ourselves. I run a small business. I import from China and Italy. We've got all the plans in place. We have for 6 months. Normal people in this country will sort it out with a great response. So just get on with it. What,
James, tell me, what has in particular shifted your view? Is it your belief in the democratic result, or is it something else?
The way we've been treated over the past 12 months has been quite poor from the European Union. Our so-called friends and neighbours have become somewhat hostile, I would say. So, jolly good. We're British, stiff upper lip, and we'll bugger off somewhere else, quite frankly.
Right. Well, you put that pretty succinctly. So would you say that a compromise and a watering down and a Brexit in name only, in a sense, is the worst of both worlds?
You cannot please the many on this one. You just can't please them all. So I think many people now just want a decision. And I don't think the decision is the weak one. If anything, let's back a stronger one now.
And just get on with it. Just get on with it. James, great comment. Fascinating. Thank you. Harry is a first-time caller from Cookham in Berkshire. Good evening, Harry.
Hi, Nigel. 2 quick points.
Yep.
Firstly, I think that given that certain members of the House of Commons are trying to hijack Brexit, or probably a majority of them are, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg's idea of prorogation of Parliament isn't a bad
Harry,
one.
I'm going to discuss that point later.
Okay,
I will. I promise you. But in terms of the compromise, Harry,
Nigel, hang on, let me finish. The second one, Nigel, which I think we need to take very seriously, is that if Parliament is going to obstruct the will of the people, then I think we need to put pressure on the likes of Ireland, Germany and France, and 17.4 million people in this country should start thinking about boycotting goods from those countries, which would bring them to their knees. And a boycott of goods, if publicised as a campaign with your good self, would soon make them realise that they're going to lose billions of pounds overnight.
It's a slightly negative campaign, but I get what you're saying.
I appreciate that.
But I get what you're saying.
We're in territory here.
And by the way, have you heard, Harry?
Around.
Have you heard what Tim Martin, the boss of Wetherspoons, has been saying about this?
Well, he's on my wavelength. You seem to have gone soft yourself.
Soft? Good.
Yeah.
God, I've been called many things, but not that. Many things, Harry, some of which have even been true, but I've never been called that. Now, I mean, Tim Martin's line is, we used to import Jägermeister, we now make our own version up in Chorley in Lancashire, and it's selling well. We don't buy French wines, we buy English sparkling wines and Australian reds, and if there's going to be all this trouble at the port of Dover, as the Remainers tell us, we're getting goods in and out, we'll stop trading with Europe. So that's the Tim Martin line. It's a form of economic nationalism. Harry,
Answer me one quick question.
Yeah, go on.
Who will suffer the most out of a no-deal Brexit? Will it be Ireland or will it be the UK?
It'll be Ireland big time. It'll be Ireland big time.
Massively. They have got a goods deficit with us. We're a service-based economy on the whole anyway.
Well, we are, of course we are.
If you look at the net disadvantage to the Republic of Ireland out of a no-deal, why won't the pip squeak on this one? Why don't we apply some pressure?
But, Harry, here's the problem. You are arguing the economic logic for a negotiated no-deal Brexit, and I'm with you. I'm completely with you. No deal, no problem, let's go WTO. Right, fine. But what happens next Tuesday? if next Tuesday the amendment that's been put down by Yvette Cooper and others passes, and effectively Parliament has ruled out a no-deal Brexit, and Jacob and Co are in the position, they either back some form of Mrs May's deal or face the prospect of Article 50 being extended and the probability of a second referendum. If no deal's off the table, if what you believe in, Harry, is effectively off the table, what would you do in those circumstances?
Prorogation of Parliament. It's not a dissolution of Parliament.
It ain't going to happen, Harry. It ain't going to happen in a million years. It ain't going to happen in a million years.
You're already preparing, Nigel, for a second referendum. I won't refuse to call it.
Well, do you know something?
Call it a people's
well,
because that gives a bias in favour of the so-called people.
Oh, I don't accept that argument.
And it assumes that the majority are Remainers.
So, am I wrong, Harry? Am I wrong? Am I wrong to be? You're not listening. Am I wrong to be preparing for the worst-case scenario?
You're not wrong. But I entreat people to stop buying Irish beef, and they're the ones who will suffer most. They've got to tick the box. We all know that the Irish question on this one is a tactic by the EU to get us locked into a deal that suits them with the political declaration that comes after the withdrawal agreement. It's a complete ploy. It's so transparent. We need Thatcher, we need somebody with some bollocks, and I'm afraid May is not that person.
Yeah, not a word we use often here before the watershed, but I do understand, Harry, that you care a lot about this issue, and hey, John Burker and Michael Gove have been using it over the course of the last few days, and Harry, where I will agree with you completely is that May is not the right person. Thank you very much indeed. Nigel, Jacob Rees-Mogg has gone right down in my opinion. I'm disgusted with him, says John from Burnham-on-Sea in Somerset. Well, I wouldn't be disgusted with him, John. I mean, he's trying desperately to find a way forward, and you can tell that he's now genuinely worried that no deal will get taken off the table by Parliament next week, and you're left with this choice of a devil or a deep blue sea. He is not in an easy position. And when it comes to it, if this deal of some kind passes, I'm going to be in this position in Strasbourg in March. And right at the moment, I'm thinking, the hell with this deal and the hell with 2025. Who knows? Maybe I've gone soft, as Harry said. Perhaps I'll support it. I don't think so, though. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 6:30. Well, our last caller talked about Parliament being prorogued, and this first cropped up last week, and it was raised by backbench MP Sir Desmond Swayne. He said to guarantee Brexit, the Prime Minister should prorogue Parliament until April. Tempting, isn't it? And Jacob Rees-Mogg raised this issue again today at a Bruges Group meeting. Let's hear him.
If the House of Commons undermines our basic constitutional conventions, then the executive is entitled to use other vestigial constitutional means to stop it, by which I basically mean prorogation. And prorogation normally lasts for 3 days, but any law that is in the process before prorogation falls. And I think that would be the government's answer. That is the government's backstop, to use a choice phrase. And that if the government allows no deal to be taken off the table, that would be a failure of the government, and then it would be the job of backbench MPs to hold the government to account.
So our constitution allows this. The prorogation of Parliament marks the end of a parliamentary session. It is the formal name given to the period between the end of a session of Parliament, which can be called by the government, and the state opening of Parliament that begins the next session with the Queen's speech. The parliamentary session may also be prorogued before Parliament is dissolved. So, actually, she's able to do it. Theresa May could just say, enough of your knavish tricks. We're closing Parliament down. We're leaving without a deal on March the 29th at 11 p.m. And that's why Sir Desmond Swayne said, tempting, isn't it? Trouble is that in the end, the Queen would get dragged into this, and the Queen herself would have to endorse that prorogation of Parliament on advice from her own Privy Council. And, of course, her own Privy Council are made up of the establishment of the last few decades, 90% Remainers and Euro fanatics. But the Queen, of course, takes advice and could, in that situation, make her own decision. I don't think Queen Elizabeth II would welcome being dragged into all of this, and I don't believe the British Prime Minister is going to do this in 1,000 light years, even if it's possible. But I do agree with Sir Desmond Swain. It is very tempting, and we would get the Brexit we voted for. I hope we've dealt with that point fairly and fully. Back to the compromises that are perhaps being made, and certainly Daniel Kaczynski prepared to make them, and Jacob hinting at them without going anything like as far. Kaczynski saying, ERG group member, that if the backstop was limited to 2025, he might vote for Mrs May's deal. I am not for that. Good evening, Nigel, says Liz from Islington. I'm beginning to believe that a second referendum is better than a bad deal. I know people that initially voted Remain, but would now vote to leave. Well, Liz, and I'm sure there are some that have gone the other way. What I think is really interesting, and we've been examining this for the last few weeks, is the People's Vote campaign. I mean, gosh, they're clever. I mean, you know, you've got to give it to Alistair Campbell and Roland Rudd and Adonis and all this mob. I mean, they are actually rather clever because they conduct a series of polls asking a question in a certain way and say, there you are, here's the evidence, the people want a second referendum. The truth is, out in the country, there is no great demand for a second referendum, none whatsoever. And yet, Liz, it's beginning to grow in Parliament. And I sense, Liz, you're the second message tonight I've got from a Leaver saying, maybe we have to just do this again and crush them. Robert is a first-time caller from Blackpool. Welcome, Robert.
Hello, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call tonight.
Good evening.
The topic tonight seems to be, should we make a compromise?
Yes.
And like yourself, I voted leave through UKIP by proxy via a UKIP representative here in Blackpool. And I've been adamant to leave the European Union for all this time. And what sickens me now is all these options, as you previously mentioned, are coming out. And it really feels like Parliament, on the whole, is against us and are doing everything they can to scupper any deal. And that the Labour government, combined with the SNP, are just going to keep voting down any deal, no matter how good the deal is, going to vote it down every single time.
Well, Robert, had the deal been an acceptable deal, 118 Tory MPs wouldn't have voted against it, would they?
They would if they wanted to remain in Europe, I believe. I mean, we've got the European Union who wants to keep us tied in and are using the backstop. And so as a result, I'm worried that if we don't make some kind of compromise, then we're going to get tied in, and it will go to a people's vote. During the last two and a half years...
Robert, come on. It's not a people's vote. It's a second referendum, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a loser's vote, basically.
Absolutely.
And yes, it's another referendum. However, for the last 2.5 years, people's opinion have been swayed by the Remainers, who have been actively doing this, as I say, for 2.5 years, whereas the people who voted Brexit are sat quietly waiting for the results to be honoured. And much as, you know, I don't vote very often, but this was one of the key things in my life. I voted to leave Europe. And it now seems that Mrs May and a few of her MPs are the only ones who really do seem to be pushing it forward. And it terrifies me, the thought that Jeremy Corbyn is just playing party politics to use this to force a general election because he thinks at this time of weakness he stands a chance of getting in.
So is there an argument then, Robert, despite, and you used the word yourself, how adamant you'd been since the referendum, is the Kaczynski argument that you make a lot of compromises you wouldn't normally make just to get us to leave the treaty on March 29th, that's becoming more tempting to you, yeah?
I wouldn't necessarily say make a lot of compromises. I mean, I live in an area that suffers quite badly from austerity, and there are key things and my own reasons for wanting to leave the EU. Such as the freedom of movement, that kind of thing, means more to me than whether or not we leave on world trade or we stay part of the single market. Those are things I would compromise on. It seems to be that Mrs May's deal would have given us the best of both worlds. We would have been able to trade with Europe and seek out other deals. So on that score...
No, I wouldn't buy that, Robert, at all. There was a 585-page document that potentially kept us locked in the customs union, in the certainly the single market stroke customs union, almost in perpetuity. And Robert, it was a rotten deal with a 28-page political declaration with a list of promises that frankly compromised not much more than a child's wish list to Father Christmas. So, Robert, it wasn't delivering. Robert, I hear the pain of the personal journey you're going through on this, and so many people are. They're struggling with this. Lack of leadership, I believe, is the key. Will is a first-time caller from Swindon. Good evening, Will.
Good evening, Mr. Farage. It's a real pleasure to speak to you.
Welcome.
We're big fans of you in our household, so
welcome.
Nice to yeah. I was shocked with obviously the situation with the RG. I thought that this would polarise it more. So I think it's all out of fear, isn't it? It's fear of the what ifs. But I think with the watering down side of things, if you keep watering things down, eventually it will be defeated, and I think the status quo will remain. So I think it's quite important that we don't just water it down and just accept, we'll compromise on this, because it was seen as an in and out kind of vote. But that was what it was sold to me as, and that was.
So would you tell Will? Would you tell Jacob to hold firm?
Yes, I think so. I think I like Mr. Rees-Mogg. I think he's.
So do I.
One of the few people who sort of talk sense in all of it. He's not emotional. He's very logical with it. But I think he's worried that they'll vote it down or that it won't get through, and then it won't happen at all.
Well, what he's worried about, Will, with some justification, is that Article 50 gets suspended, a second referendum comes another year down the line, we've wasted a whole load more time, and he doesn't want that to happen.
Ask a silly question, though. So, obviously the government at the moment, 80% of the government voted to pass that bill to leave if there was no deal agreed.
Yep.
So we're then
498 MPs voted for it, and now they're ratting en masse.
Is that not the definition of hypocrisy, though, if they vote one thing and then all of a sudden...
Oh, well, come on. I think hypocrisy is far too polite a word, but I can't use the word. But I really can't use the words I want to use at this time of the night. Will, thank you for your call. And this concept of prorogation brought up by Desmond Swain and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the fact that I've raised that the Queen would directly be involved in this is exciting one or two of you. Anthony on Facebook says, it's time Her Majesty stepped in and told all ministers that voted for Article 50 to be triggered, they should not now be able to vote against it, and if they want to, she would just accept their resignations. And Robert says, in my opinion, it's time the Queen intervenes and orders Parliament to stick to the Brexit leaving date with or without a deal, or face a dissolution until April, when there should be an election. Well, interesting. Some very, very strong views there. And wasn't that a funny cartoon of Theresa May talking to the Queen, and the Queen saying, "You made an awful mess of this. Philip will give you a lift home." Gosh, I enjoyed that. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show here at LBC at 6:46. Well, whilst Parliament agonises, of course, Davos, the annual meeting of the globalists, is taking place. Tony Blair being pictured today with the new boss of Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro. Now, very interesting that Jose Angel Gurria, the Secretary-General of the OECD, organisations, of course, all of whom told us that Brexit would be a catastrophe. And yet, at Davos today, he has said advanced economies are absolutely ready for no deal, and makes the point much of the world is running on WTO rules these days. That was interesting. Also, folks, on the economics, and remember, you keep hearing these predictions of doom and gloom. Well, let's be a little bit more optimistic, shall we? You know, the UK's trade deficit is down in the course of the last year, and our exports have increased by 111 billion sterling to 610 billion since the referendum. There is some joy out there. Deloitte's today produce a report saying that in the last 3 years, 3,900 recorded foreign and direct investment projects have come into the United Kingdom, creating 260,000 jobs, and that is more than France and Germany combined. That, of course, on top of the Department of Work and Pensions figures yesterday showing that now there are 32.53 million people in employment in this country, a record ever number, and the best news of the lot, and partly because there are fewer people coming into the UK since the referendum from outside, wages increased 3.3% year on year. Where are you, Mr. Osborne? It's not the catastrophe that you said. So, talk today. Daniel Kaczynski, some hints from Jacob Rees-Mogg. They might make some compromises. They might back Mrs May's deal if there are changes on the backstop for fear that the Remainers could hijack Parliament. Is this the right thing to do? I'm going to Richard, who's in the car on his way to Dorset. Good evening, Richard.
Evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
I'm the MP for South Dorset, and I've been listening to your show for the last 45 minutes. I thought I'd ring to cheer you up because you sound a bit down.
Please do, Richard. So, are you lot all about to sell out?
No, we are not. As many of my colleagues have said, now is the time to stand firm. In fact, now is the time to stand firm. And as you rightly have pointed out, and many of your other listeners have, the EU will move to us, but so long as we do stand firm, because we have so many of the cards in our hand.
Yes.
And as for the amendments and so forth being put into the House next week, let's wait and see what happens to those. But at the moment, people are reacting to fear. That is not a healthy place to come from. The people of this country voted to leave the EU, and that's what I and my colleagues are doing our very best to ensure happens.
Well, Richard, I'm very pleased to hear that. And yet, Daniel Kaczynski, who has become very much a hardline leaver since the referendum, is saying that if the backstop's got a 5-year time limit, he finds that acceptable. Do you find that acceptable?
No, I don't. And you mentioned the political protocol, and I think this is something that your listeners need to be aware of, and many people are not. Even if we get a deal, a withdrawal deal, the political protocol, as you rightly said, is a scruffy bit of paper with not much in it. And the French and others, well, the French are demanding our fishing waters, the Spain will want to move in Gibraltar, and that's just the start of it. I mean, these negotiations, even if we get this deal, and you mentioned 9 years with a 5-year backstop, this could go on indefinitely for a year and years and years and years, and the rancor and division that we see every day today and getting worse will only get worse and continue. So to me, the only logical conclusion now is we must leave with no deal. Because
Richard,
I'm convinced.
Richard, I understand why you say that. Let me ask you one final question. If no deal gets taken off the table by Parliament next week and the government accepts that position, are you prepared to take the risk of Article 50 being extended and a second referendum? Are you prepared to take that risk by voting down a bad deal?
I don't think it'll come to that, Nigel. I really don't. I mean, the government's not going to take it off the table. Mrs May is, for once, standing firm, and I'm hugely reassured. It's her deal or no deal. And I'm convinced, because it's got to be her, Nigel. It's got to be her who changes the law. And from what she said repeatedly, she's not going to do that.
Well,
So I have got to believe that.
All right, well, I know you've got to believe it, you're right, and I hope you're right. And Richard, thank you for pulling over on the way down to Dorset and making that phone call. Well, thank you. Well, there's an ERG supporter saying, no, he's not compromising one bit. He believes if we play hardball, they're going to come to us. He also thinks the Prime Minister will stay firm. Can't say that I'm convinced. And this business of prorogation has got many of you excited. Michigan saying, the Queen must intervene. The Queen must intervene. Craig says Article 50 won't be suspended. The EU won't allow it unless there is a good reason. Well, of course, the good reason, Craig, could be the promise that maybe a second referendum was coming down the road. Nigel, if Brexit was so brilliant and such an amazing idea, then we'd all want it by now. And yet we're getting a nonsense deal that's worse than what we had. It's gone from sunny uplands and unicorns to a rubbish deal, says Matt. Matt, that's not because of Brexit. That's because somebody called Mrs May. Paul asks a really key question. If we went with May's deal, could we change it later after we'd left the EU? In theory, Paul, we could, but in practice, look what a heave it was to even get this change. We'd have to go through the whole thing against the political class all over again. Bombarded with first-time callers. One of them is Joe, who lives in Ware in Hertfordshire. Good evening, Joe.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, I suppose. I'm still against Mrs. May's deal, even if there's a change in the backstop. Joe, to me, it's a rubbish deal anyway.
Do you know what I think? I think that the ERG and Parliament is getting so worried that it's going to be delayed or there's going to be a second referendum. I think there's going to be a fudged deal go through, and I do think we'll leave on the 29th. And I think that people like Jacob Rees-Mogg are going to have no choice but to vote for a deal.
Well, Joe, I have to say, and Ian Dale will be taking over in a minute or two, and he's, I think, rather of that view as well, that there is as I said at the start of the show...
I think you're coming round to that view as well.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not, Dale. I'm not. I'm a hardliner. I'm voting against this. I really am. But, Joe, there has been a shift in the wind. I think there is such a fear. There is such a fear. But Joe, just because you're frightened of the Remainers, is it right to give up on your principles?
Well, I've also got a friend who's got another take on it as well, that the Europeans are going to budge, are going to move quite a bit, because they want to, in his words, get their grubby little hands on the 39 billion. And he thinks that's their priority over keeping us in. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think it's possible. And it's a great thing with the European Union, 11th hour deals. But hey, if it's still a rotten deal, Joe, it's still a rotten deal. Thank you for your call. Make sure you download the LBC Global App Player. As well as listening to LBC, you can listen back to this and other LBC programmes, as well as a range of other podcasts. At 10 tonight's Tom Swarbrick. But now, as you know already, it's Ian Dale.